I really like to stay up to date with the baits and techniques that are working across the country, and I like to watch what baits are dominating or catching fish in these big events like the Bassmaster Classic, the Bassmaster Opens, the Toyota Series. And one thing that I noticed over the past couple of weeks is that an old school technique is making a comeback. An old school bait is coming back to the scene and played a big part in the Bassmaster Classic, and then also was used by Casey Scanlon to win the Bassmaster Open on Norfolk. And what that technique is flipping a tube. Now, this is actually a really old school presentation. A tube is one of the very first baits that I flipped when I got into bass fishing. And in today's video, I'm going to teach you everything you need to know about flipping a tube, why it's such an effective technique, and how you can utilize it to catch more big bass. Let's dive into this thing. Now, if you guys don't know who I am, my name is Benjamin Nowak, and this channel is dedicated to teaching you bass fishing tips, taking you on trips, and teaching you about techniques like flipping a tube to help you go out and catch more big fish. So if you guys enjoy that style of content, please consider subscribing to the channel and growing this community. And I'd love to know, have you flipped a tube, or what are some of your favorite baits for flipping and pitching around cover? But without further ado, let's dive into this thing. The reason I actually noticed this trend was because Hunter Shryock made a video talking about flipping a tube at the Classic on Ray Roberts and had a really big day 2 and 3 flipping a tube around standing timber. And then lo and behold, Casey Scanlon ended up winning the Open on Norfolk a couple weeks later. And it got me really thinking, like, one of the very first baits that I remember learning about when you started talking about flipping and pitching was flipping a tube. Denny Brower had the Strike King flipping tube. Berkeley Havoc came out with the Ike Smash tube, and that was like when I was just getting into fishing. The Havoc baits were really, really popular, and they came out with this 4-inch flattened flipping tube. And as I think about some of these baits that kind of make these ebbs and flows in the sport, flipping a tube is one of those techniques, and it's a really, really effective approach to catch really big bass. And it's a technique that not quite as many people are using anymore. But before we dive into all of the details on why flipping a tube is so useful and really the tube setup, let's talk about the gear that I'm going to use. And so for me, up here in the north where I'm flipping, more sparse cover, I'm typically going with something like a 7.3 medium heavy TFO Option Bass Series rod. I don't need a rod. I'm not flipping this into super heavy matted grass or vegetation. I'm not putting it in super, super heavy, thick cover. So for me, that 7.3 medium heavy is nice because I can either cast that bait out away from the boat, or I can flip it into that sparse milfoil offshore, and I still have the power to move that fish. I also can skip this bait up around docks or around shallow cover and still effectively use a flipping tube in those situations. So 7.3 medium heavy rod is what I like to go with. Has a little bit softer tip, but I can drive that hook home and move those fish when they eat this bait, kind of in that more sparse open water situation. Then the line that I'm throwing is 17 or 20 pound test line. I am flipping it around moderately heavy cover. I like to go with that heavier fluorocarbon line. I'm fishing clean water. I don't want to go with a braided line in most situations. So that 17 or 20 pound test fluorocarbon is really, really important. And then I'm fishing it on a high speed 7 or 8 speed gear ratio bait casting setup. So that's my general setup, but let's really dive into why I believe a tube is such an effective presentation that catches big fish in a lot of situations from Michigan to Texas. And really what it boils down to is just how effective a tube really is. It's a really, really natural, non-intrusive presentation. It doesn't have a lot of crazy flapping appendages, and it does a really good job of imitating a variety of different bait fish and forage. If you want it to imitate a bluegill, you can go with something like this green pumpkin, purple, and gold flake. If you want it to imitate a shad, you can go with a white base color. It can imitate a crawfish, a goby. A tube just in general imitates so many different types of forage, and it looks really natural. When this bait falls through the column, it falls at a relatively natural pace, and it looks like what those fish are feeding on. That, to me, is the most important point when you're flipping a tube. You really want to match the color of this presentation to the water clarity you're fishing and the forage type that those bass are keyed in on. And the other nice thing is that being a northern angler, I have tubes on my boat when I'm out there smallmouth fishing, and for the most part, you don't have to have a crazy special tube. This is nothing special. This is a Berkeley Power Bait 3.5-inch tube. This is the same tube you'd throw for smallmouth, but you can get a little specialized, and I'll dive into that here in a minute, with some different tube profiles and tube models that will stand up maybe a little bit better to this profile. But in general, this approach is not really anything crazy. It just looks like what those fish are feeding on. It's a non-intrusive approach. When you flip it into that piece of cover, it really doesn't have a ton of action, so you can catch those really pressured fish. So with that said, where do I believe flipping a tube would actually be a better approach than some of those standard flipping baits like a Beast Coast Flippin' Delight, a Rage Bug? Where do I think flipping a tube would make a difference? And for me, this is a bait that really is effective, especially during the late spring into the post-spawn and into the summertime months, or when those fish are super pressured, especially up here in the north during the springtime. Guys get really excited. They like to head out and go fishing early spring. You're going to see a lot of fish get really pressured because there's a lot of boats on your water early season. You can pick up a flipping tube, go behind those guys that are flipping in that cover with a jig or a bigger standard flipping style approach and catch fish behind those guys utilizing a little flipping tube. And to me, that is really the benefit of flipping a tube in that piece of cover, is how effective it is at catching those pressured fish. The other really unique thing about flipping a tube is that it kind of has a darty, unpredictable action in the water. You know this if you fish a tube a lot for smallmouth. When that bait falls, it likes to have a spiral down and kind of an unpredictable action. You can get some of that action out of a flipping tube, and I don't think you can get that same action out of a lot of different baits. So for me, really flipping a tube is really, really nice when those fish are pressured, and if you want something that is a little bit different that other guys aren't utilizing out there on the water. Now let's dive into a couple different baits and maybe some unique gear that you can utilize to help you catch more fish. Now, like I mentioned, you can use just your standard 3.5-inch tube. This is what Hunter Shryock was using down at the Bassmaster Classic. It was just a 3.5-inch Berkeley power bait power tube. It's a super, super simple presentation. This color here is Goby Magic. Your favorite color, whatever matches the forage in your bodies of water. Super, super, super simple to just use your favorite style 3.5-inch tube. However, as you get into more of the summertime months, those fish become a little bit more aggressive. You want a little bit bigger profile. The very first tube that I ever flipped was a Big Bite Baits 4-inch craw tube. And what makes this bait so different is that it has a little bit bigger profile, obviously, but it has these craw-style appendages. These don't really kick a lot. They don't move a lot of water. It's not that big of a difference, but it's something similar to like a brush hog profile off the side, and it's just a little bit bigger, bulkier profile that does a really good job of imitating those crawdads or bigger bluegill in the water. So during the summertime when those fish get on a little bit bigger bait, I really like this craw tube profile. It's a bigger profile. I think it catches me those bigger fish, and it's just something a little bit different in the water when those fish get on those bigger bait fish. And in that craw tube, my favorite colors are 1099, which is black and blue on one side and green pumpkin on the other, or Sprague Grass, which is like a watermelon with purple and then a watermelon green. Sprague Grass for me is one of my go-to summertime colors for largemouth. It's just a really, really, really effective color. It's green pumpkin purple on one side, green pumpkin green on the other, and especially during the middle of summer, this is a color I really like, is a Sprague Grass. But with these two colors, you really can't go wrong, but just match the forage in your body of water or the color of the water that you're fishing, and you're going to have success flipping a tube. So I'm sure by this point in the video, there are comments down in the comment section talking about how guys lose a lot of fish flipping a tube, which is why a lot of guys don't use this presentation. A lot of guys lose a lot of fish when they flip a tube. And the reason for that is really twofold. The first one is that the weight size that they're using and the style of rigging that weight to their bait is too large. Okay, they're using too big of a weight when they flip a tube. What that does is it creates this big profile in that fish's mouth. When you go to set the hook, it blows the fish's mouth open, causes this tube to ball up down on the hook, and those fish don't get the bait very effectively. That's key number one. Key number two with the weight is the fact that they're pegging that weight. To me, pegging the weight is a really, really bad thing when you're flipping a tube. The only time that I peg a weight when I'm flipping is if I'm putting it in super heavy cover where I need that bait to go through with the weight. In most cases, I want to flip this bait into a piece of cover, have that weight separate, and give that bait a more natural profile, being pulled down in the water column by that weight separated. Okay, so what that's going to do, you're going to flip that bait in, your weight's connected, your weight's going to separate, and your bait can fall more naturally through the water column. That's going to give that fish more time to find your bait, and with that weight separation, it's going to allow that fish to get that bait in his mouth without having that weight connected to it. I also fish a lighter size weight. This is a 3/16 of an ounce. I'm typically going no heavier than a 1/4 of an ounce when I'm flipping a tube. I want a really light, natural profile presentation. And a lot of times I'm using this when I'm fishing sparse vegetation or isolated pieces of cover. So I don't need to peg that weight or use a really heavy weight to get it to go into the cover that I'm fishing. And one thing maybe you guys have already noticed is that the hook that I use has a welded ring on the front of it. This is a Gamakatsu ringed superline hook. VMC also makes one, but to me what that does is it gives that bait a lot more natural action in the water as opposed to tying directly to the hook itself. It's going to allow this bait to have a lot more natural action, and when I set the hook, it's going to straighten out that ring first and then the hook, and it's going to allow that hook to position properly in the fish's mouth. That's tip number one. The other thing that I do with that hook is I'll put a small bend in the hook point. So instead of that hook point directly in line with the eye of the hook, there's a small offset. And what that offset does when you go to set the hook is it allows this bait to catch in that fish's mouth a lot more effectively. Even if your bait does ball up down the shank of the hook, that offset should allow you to get that hook point to penetrate somewhere in that fish's mouth. And honestly, probably one of the easiest things that I can recommend you guys do when you fish a tube is, even if you're not fishing it on a ringed hook, when you thread that tube up on your hook, you don't want it to cover up the eye of your hook. You want this gap right here, this bend in your hook, to be able to hold that tube, and by doing so, it's going to really prevent this tube from sliding down the shank of your hook, balling up in that fish's mouth, which a lot of times is a reason that you don't get a good hook in that fish's mouth. So those really are the keys for me in using that ringed hook, in using a non-pegged weight, in using a lighter size weight to help me ensure that I land a lot of the fish that bite my tube. Admittedly, fishing a tube is something I haven't done probably in the last 1.5 or 2 years, but it is a really effective approach. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, it's a really effective approach for a couple of reasons. A lot of guys like me have put that flipping tube away, but also because of the natural profile in the water, the unique darting action when you do pop that bait up and it separates from the weight, and really it just looks like the forage that those fish are feeding on. So if you guys are flipping a bait this spring, I would really encourage you guys to try to flip a tube and see the kind of success that you have flipping a bait like a tube this spring. Now, if you guys enjoyed this style video, go down and consider giving it a thumbs up, subscribing to the channel if you're not already, or hit that button right there, which will subscribe you to the channel and let you know when I post more videos just like this one. If you guys want to see a video where I talk about flipping a jig in the springtime, click this video right here. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. Take care, tight lines. God bless. Pursue your passion.